Hear these sacred words from the Gospel of Matthew. Then Peter came to Jesus and said to him, "Lord, if another member of the church sins against me, how often should I forgive? As many as 7 times?" Jesus said to him, "Not 7 times, but I tell you 77 times. For this reason, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his slaves. When he began the reckoning, one who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him, and as he could not pay, his Lord ordered him to be sold, together with his wife and children and all his possessions, and payment to be made. Slave fell on his knees before him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the Lord of that slave released him and forgave him the debt. But that same slave, as he went out, came upon one of his fellow slaves who owed him 100 denarii, and seizing him by the throat, he said, 'Pay me what you owe.' His fellow slave fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.' But he refused. He went and threw him into prison until he would pay the debt. When his fellow slaves saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their Lord what had taken place. Then his Lord summoned him and said, 'You wicked slave, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. Should you not have had mercy on your fellow slave as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his Lord handed him over to be tortured until he would pay his entire debt. So my heavenly Father will also do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother or sister from your heart." This is the word of the Lord. Back when I was an undergraduate, the eminent scholar of world religions, Huston Smith, came to Durham to speak, and because I was enrolled in a class on interfaith dialogue, I had the opportunity to share dinner and conversation with Professor Smith, whose 1958 book, The World's Religions, chronicled his lifelong journey of seeking wisdom from within the diversity of religious expressions across the globe. Smith, who died a couple of years ago at the age of 97, was one of those people with whom you immediately connected. He was a gentle and loving soul who that evening took time to listen carefully and engage with the questions asked by a group of students. I will never forget the answer Huston Smith gave to one of my classmates' questions about the distinctiveness of each religious tradition. He reflected for several minutes on the practices and beliefs of a wide range of religions, and then when he came to Christianity, his own tradition since childhood, the son of Methodist missionaries in China, Smith paused for a moment. "Well," he said, "for Christians it has to be forgiveness. The worship of a God who forgives and who requires followers to forgive one another as well." "Yes, that's it," he said. "For Christians, it is the God who forgives and the commandment to forgive." I think Houston Smith was right about the faith we profess and the God we worship. I believe that forgiveness is the theological core value of our belief and practice. And I also believe, and I know by experience, as do you, that forgiveness is among the most difficult and challenging of our convictions as well. I think that's why Jesus spent so much time on the topic. I think that's why he offered both direct teachings, commandments, and these clever stories that reinforce the significance of forgiveness. This morning's passage contains both. In fact, one way to read Matthew's 18th chapter is that the entire chapter is an extended discourse on the topic of forgiveness. The chapter begins with the disciples. They're all huddled around Jesus, and they ask him an intriguing question. Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? As usual, Jesus has an even more intriguing answer. Rather than a direct response, he calls a child forward in the midst of the disciples, and then he responds and says, "Unless you change and become like this child, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, what does it mean to become like a child? There are many good answers to that question, but today I'm thinking of forgiveness. If you've ever watched a group of children playing, one thing you'll notice is the speed and ease with which wrongs are reported, acknowledged, and dismissed. Whole relationships can be utterly destroyed and entirely rebuilt in a matter of seconds. This summer, I watched this happen. It was a hot afternoon. Sarah was out of town, and I was out of patience. And so I took our boys to West Park, where there is a wonderful little concrete stream and then fountains for splashing. We were there on that splash pad, which was filled with toddlers, far more toddlers than fountains. I noticed that there were several overbearing adults attempting with little success to impose fairness and time limits on the children. And then I watched as an older child, maybe 5 or 6, walked over and shoved another down, pushing him off of the fountain so that he could have access as the next splash pad launch took place. As soon as the child pushed his friend down, the adults closest launched into action, approaching the offender and encouraging, no, requiring him to apologize, to say he was sorry for his act. The 5-year-old begrudgingly obliged, and then I watched with wonder as that young child who had been wronged reached out and gave the offender a big hug. Together they ran back into the splashing water. If you want to experience the kingdom of God, Jesus says, become like that child. Later in the same chapter, the theme continues as Peter has another question for Jesus, this one much more practical and utilitarian. So Jesus, if I am mistreated, how many times do I need to offer forgiveness to another? Peter even helpfully offers a potential answer. He chooses the generous and biblical number of 7 times. Well, again, the response Jesus offers is mystifying and unnerving, not 7 times, but 77 times. With Peter surely dumbfounded, Jesus shifts from command It's a story. If the command seems extreme, the parable is meant to show that it is no more extreme than the forgiveness we have been offered. The story of the unforgiving servant teaches us that we forgive because we have been forgiven. The commandment to be reconciled to one another is rooted in our own indebtedness to the grace of God. The sin of the unforgiving servant is failing to acknowledge the depth of his need, the grace that he has received. Instead, the man lives out of a vengeance and selfishness. Ironic when he has been treated with such generosity and acceptance. The lesson is that forgiveness is central to the heart of God, and therefore must be central to us as well. I'm sure you've noticed that forgiveness has all but disappeared from the social, cultural, and political discourse of our time. No, we hear far more about blame and fault and excuse. Whenever we are determined to show no weakness and give no ground, forgiveness is nearly non-existent. I have lamented from this pulpit before the extreme incivility that has come to characterize public discourse and personal interaction in our time. And I wonder if perhaps the unique gift of the church in such a time as this is to model the gift and the command of forgiveness. Now, I do understand how difficult forgiveness is for many of us. After all, when we have been wounded, the human impulse is to hold on to that pain, perhaps even wear it like a badge of honor, becoming a victim of all that has harmed us. But forgiveness can break that cycle of blame that simply perpetuates pain and assures us of endless conflict. Imagine the gift of honest confession, the freedom of release from guilt and shame. Imagine the freedom of releasing a grudge held far too long, rotting our souls and isolating us from each other. Forgiveness is freedom. Remember the healing you felt when one dear to you spoke those powerful words, "I forgive you." Perhaps in this very moment there is someone whom you have been struggling to forgive, or someone whose forgiveness you long to receive. Maybe months or even years have passed, and the pain you caused or the pain you felt has hardened and settled deeply into your identity. My counsel to you is this: don't wait another moment. This week, even this afternoon, seek them out and be reconciled to one another. Embrace forgiveness. Do what you can to make peace and restore relationship, and then claim your identity as a forgiven forgiver. A couple of years ago, I was preparing to conduct a memorial service. It was for the grandmother of a church member. I had been warned by members of the family that the woman had a daughter who had been estranged from her two siblings and the rest of the family for many, many years. Poor decisions and harsh words had characterized her relationship to the family, and they told me they weren't even sure their sister would be coming to the service. I think it's fair to say they were afraid what might happen if she did come to the service. As the family was gathering in my office just before the service began, one of the ushers knocked on the door of my office and opened it. And there stood a woman I knew immediately to be the estranged sister. I knew it because of the tension I felt the moment she walked in the room. She stood quietly in the doorway and looked all around my office. Finally, her older brother walked over, and he embraced her. I will never forget that tall man kissing his sister on the top of her head, and then with tears in his eyes, motioning for the rest of the family to join the circle. I'm not sure I've ever seen a clearer picture of the power of forgiveness than the one I witnessed as those three siblings walked hand in hand out of my office to honor their mother's life. Henry Nouwen said, "Forgiveness is the name of love practiced among those who love poorly." Each week when we gather in worship, we pause after our opening hymn and we do something peculiar, strange, unusual, out of the ordinary. We say that we are not perfect. We remind ourselves of who we are in the light of God's glory, sinners, broken, frail, fallen, human creatures. People who can never seem to get it right no matter how hard we try. As a community, we ask for God's mercy, and surrounded by our family of faith, we are strong enough to admit how weak we are. But we never stop there, because the gospel does not stop there. Before we are overcome by despair, we hear words of assurance that are music to our ears. In Jesus Christ, we are forgiven. In that moment, we are called to be forgiven forgivers, not because we are perfect, but because God is gracious. Having been given the freedom from all that holds us captive, we are empowered to free somebody else, to practice what Reinhold Niebuhr called the final form of love, forgiveness. It was October of 2006, Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, about a mile from where my grandmother lives in the beautiful Amish community. You may remember the horrific events of that day. A one-room schoolhouse becomes the scene of a horrible crime. 5 young children murdered by a disturbed local man who then took his own life. It was a story of immense and irreparable pain repeated far too often in the years since. This one in a tranquil community committed to faith and nonviolence. Evil invaded a sacred space that day, and it might have been the end of the story. Tragedy and senseless violence. But it was not the end of the story, because days after the attack, we learned of how that faith community responded. The grandfather of one victim said to a reporter, "We must not think evil of this man. He had a mother and a soul." 30 members of the Amish community attended the shooter's funeral, and that community invited his widow to the service for their children. A week later, she wrote an open letter to her Amish neighbors. My grandmother clipped it out of the newspaper and sent it to me, thinking I might be able to use it in a sermon one day. The grieving woman wrote, "Your compassion has reached far beyond my family, even beyond our small town, and is changing the world. For this, we thank you. Now, if you remember that event, you might also remember that some were offended by the swift and complete reconciliation offered by the Amish neighbors. It was too much. It was too soon. It was outrageous. It was unthinkable. It was madness. Perhaps. Or perhaps it simply exposed the madness that we have come to call ordinary. Retribution, vengeance, hatred, obsession with getting back at those who have gotten to us. Perhaps by faith, that small community of dedicated Christian believers knew something most of us cannot even comprehend. Perhaps those irrational words of forgiveness, those radical acts of kindness, offered a mystifying window into what our faith is all about. Forgiven forgivers. May we all have the courage to be so peculiar. Amen.